Hey there, thanks for checking out my painting video. Today we're going to do a Study of the Greats episode covering Cullen, Yates. And we're going to do that picture I just flashed. I'm going to show you some of my prep work here in my sketchbook, the quick value sketch that I did to work through some of the shapes and also some of the values. Here's my palette: Ultramarine Blue, Violet, Yellow, Sap Green. Also have Burnt Umber, Titanium White, a little bit of Cadmium Red, and that's Cadmium Yellow. And by the way, that was my linseed oil. Cullen Yates was primarily a landscape and still life painter, focusing mainly on rivers, coastal scenes, villages, and flowers. He was born in Bryan, Ohio on January 24th, 1866, and he died in Shawnee, Pennsylvania in July of 1945. He lived a nice long life, obviously. And he maintained his studio and residence for many years in Shawnee on the Delaware, here in Monroe County. That location is a beautiful area with some nice golf resorts and nice areas to paddle into the wider parts of the Delaware River here. It's only about 10 minutes away from our home. So I'm about to get started here on this painting. I'm going to mix up some Sap Green with Burnt Umber, and I'm going to use this large filbert brush. It's probably a number 10, I would say. Not sure of the number or the size, but it's definitely large for this 5x7 wood panel that I'm painting on. I'm just going to block in the major darker shapes in this painting. We have a nice horizon line which starts about 2/3 of the way up in this landscape format, and there's a nice dip in the middle which creates a nice valley view. Quite a nice feature that we'll see in this little painting. It'll allow us to see some depth and also catch an interesting perspective on the sunset. That's a key feature in this painting. We'll add a little more information about Mr. Cullen Yates in a little while, but I just want to explain a little bit about what I'm doing here. So by blocking in this dark hue, or using this dark hue to block in the major shadow patterns in this painting, we're setting the tone. This is another backlit scene. I always enjoy doing them. The sunrise, or sunset rather, is off into the distance. Behind this hill, there is evidence of a little pathway, slight hint of that. Most of the patterns that we're creating here with the mixture of Burnt Umber and Sap Green are going to serve as the foundational patterns within this picture. And there's really not going to be a ton of detail. We'll look to create the illusion of detail. And one way that I'll do that is exactly how I described earlier, just by kind of roughing in, with some aggressive brush strokes with mixtures of both thin and thick paint later, as I did with my filbert brush earlier. So now, just taking a step back, looking at the original work done by Cullen Yates, and the process of observing these great works by these great artists from long ago is always one it's a rich experience. You learn a lot, trying to decode what they did, or maybe even different ways to accomplish a similar look and feel. And oftentimes there's really no right answer, because there's just no way to know for sure how it is that they achieved the results that they achieved. What I'm doing now is I'm going to mix up a couple of different shades of blue using my Ultramarine Blue and my Titanium White. And in this case, I added a little bit of Sap Green because I wanted to start working out some of the mountain ranges off in the distance in the background. And you'll see they'll go through a little bit of a transition as I try to kind of modulate the tone and the color and the saturation of the paints in order to get it right. And just to give you a little bit of the punchline, I'll probably have to touch up the mountain ranges in the background and also the sky after the painting dries a little bit, so I don't quite finish this painting, but I get it to the point where just a couple of little touches like that will help me finish this painting, to the level or to the degree that I aspire to. So there are two main mountain ranges viewable in this valley view. And the first one there has enough saturation in it where there's little hints of green from the shrubs and the trees and little hints of purple. And then there's a mountain range further off in the distance that'll have more of a blue hue. So now I'm jumping into building up some of the texture and some of the richer dark tones in the foreground. And this will take some time because the paint I started with is quite thin and the color of the pre-tinted wood panel kind of shows through. So it'll take a couple of attempts to cover that up and create the dark, shadowy, kind of gloomy feel that we have in this painting in the foreground. And that's going to be critically important because that'll offset the brightness in the background and create some of the light effects that we're hoping to create. Throughout this process, you'll see I'll block in big basic shapes like I did with those trees, for instance, and then use my paper towels or my shop towels to wipe away the excess paint. I'll do this quite a bit in nearly every large area that I've blocked in. I find that as you work through a painting and you use this method, it does a nice job of creating the illusion of detail, particularly in areas like the treetops, the edges of the branches where there might be some foliage sticking out into the sky. However, it's not quite as thick as it would be toward the center of the mass of the tree where most of the foliage lies and where most of the foliage will be, found to be most dense. So I'll do that under the tree canopy in some cases where the light is poking through some of the sky holes in the trees, but also around the edges of the trees and even the mountains in the background. So now I'm taking my titanium white, I'm going to mix it into my ultramarine blue, and I'm going to create some of the colors that I'm going to use in the sky, particularly toward the top of the sky, where the cloud cover is kind of breaking up a little bit. In the original painting by Cullen Yates, his painting was quite a bit darker than mine, at least where I'm starting. I figured I could always bring the brightness down a little bit. If I needed to bring the tenor of the painting down, I could do that in a number of ways. So mine will end up being quite a bit brighter than his, and I'm fine with that. And you'll see I'm just covering most of the space on the canvas, and I'll go in and I'll mix up some other colors that we'll see in the sky, which have quite a bit more gray in them. And I'll also wipe a bit of this more intense ultramarine blue and titanium white mixture away. So I'm just wiping away some of the excess paint on the sky area with a paper towel and carefully, in some cases, even smudging the paint a little bit to get the desired effect. And at this stage of the painting, a lot of what I'm doing now will be repeated over and over again. I'll put paint down, create shapes, and modify them and adjust them by wiping paint off with my shop towel or my paper towel. And by the way, regular paper towels will do. I just use shop towels because they're a little sturdier. And oftentimes we'll repeat this process over and over again. Put paint down, take paint off, in order to get the desired look that we're going for. And in this case, we're going for a really dark, shadowy, rich, warm foreground, and also even midground that's all backlit by an illuminated sky, illuminated by a sunset here in Northeast PA. I just mixed up some grays, and I'm going to use that to shape up parts of the sky where some gray is apparent, and then also to reinforce some of the shapes within the sky holes in the tree, and then also the areas where sky is showing through under the tree canopy. Just going to use this gray to reinforce some of those shapes and build up some textures and qualities within the sky that I see, where the clouds might be blocking out some of the sun's rays. And also it'll serve as a foundation for how we design some of the brighter, more intense illuminated parts of the sky as well. Now I'll just come through with my brush with some of that same gray that I mixed up, and I'll apply some paint in ways that you just can't with the bigger brushes that I was using earlier. Weave my way through the trees and the sky, and just create some textures and some shapes that I see amongst the clouds in Cullen Yates' original painting, and then again wiping some off, softening some edges with my shop towel. And I'll work my way around the edges of the trees and some of the other areas where some of the brighter, more intense light is going to show through, like closer to the horizon. And I'll almost completely wipe off the paint that I have. And we'll start seeing some indications of, what this painting is actually going to look like at this point. And now I'm going to dip back into my mixture of the Sap Green and burnt umber, and I'm going to reinforce some of the main shadow patterns that are part of the foreground and the midground. At this point, as I'm thinking in my version of this painting, my study of this Cullen Yates painting, I'm going to want to reinforce that little pathway, which right now looks like a triangle of sorts toward the bottom middle of the painting. I'm going to want to make sure that I put a little bit more emphasis on that. I want there to be a subtle hint of a pathway that's slightly lighter than the surrounding brush that it cuts through. And I'll just go back and forth and up and down throughout the painting and continue to reinforce these shadow patterns and build up the textures and the depth as I go. I guess when I think about the design of this painting in terms of like Edgar Payne's composition of outdoor painting and his book, this very much is, I would say, pretty close to a steel yard sort of composition design, with the shaded parts being dominant. I would say this is how I would categorize it in that regard. And I'm not aware of there being any connection between Edgar Payne and Cullen Yates, but as I continue to research the biography of Cullen Yates, maybe I'll find some connection there. Very often do when we look back at those painters from this era. It's actually kind of a fun game to play. Oftentimes you'll find surprising connections between painters. It's almost like a game of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, in a way. I did notice when I did a quick search online that there is a book an autobiography, or a biography rather. It's called Cullen, Yates, American Impressionist by Anne Weichard. So I'll probably pick up a copy of that and learn a little bit more about this guy. I know only because I have resided in Northeast PA in Monroe County for about 22 years now, that although I'm originally a Jersey boy, that he is a little bit of a legend here. You do see some of his works in museums and copies of his works and such in some of the hotels, and I think even maybe in the local library here. So and this painting obviously attracted my attention. I think it's quite nice. It's a beautiful painting that he did. And I recently saw the Historical Society, the Monroe County Historical Society here, posted a picture of his. It's one of his works where he did a still life of a bouquet of flowers on a table, and it was done incredibly well. So I was actually shocked to see that I didn't have yellow ochre on my palette. So it's a late addition there. I used a little bit of yellow ochre to help build some additional warmth in the foreground. And as I will do with every area of the painting throughout my time working on this, I'm now weaving my way through building up some of the background shapes. I added almost pure lavender, or violet rather, to that hilltop in the background that's in the front, and now I'm building up with some light blue some of the aspects of that range that's visible through this valley in the way back of the background there. So not being real careful, just trying to create some asymmetry and try to create what looks to be maybe what could be a natural shape in the background, and really not taking a lot of care to precisely copy the original, and really not taking great care to be precise with my strokes. Now I'm just softening some of the elements in the sky. Don't want there to be too many harsh lines in the sky. Very infrequent do clouds actually form in a way where there's harsh striations. So always want to take great care to soften them when you can. I'm going to do some of that same softening with the hillsides and mountain range in the background. Because it's off into the distance, typically we will not have harsh lines visible to the naked eye. So usually important to soften those elements too. I'm going back through with my handy dandy paper towel or shop towel and reshaping that mountain range off in the background, and just making sure that I carve out enough room for there to be an opportunity to highlight that sunset going over the edge of that ridge. And here I go again, just weaving my way through. Now again, going back to a brush, reinforcing some of those dark silhouetted shadows in the trees, trying to create some variance wherever the opportunity presents itself. Trees are interesting because when you paint them, it's really this dichotomy where you want to mass in the larger shape and then do the work to create the illusion of detail. A lot of people get that backwards. A lot of people will start trying to paint every branch, every leaf, and I find, at least personally, that's where I get myself into trouble sometimes. And now I'm going through and reinforcing the darker areas within the foreground, covering up some of that yellow ochre that I just laid down. And you can see the painting starting to take shape. The foreground is advancing forward, and the background is kind of reclining back, thanks to the optical illusion that happens based upon our color choices. Cooler colors going in the back, warmer colors being applied to the front, and that's where you get that atmospheric perspective. Now with this painting, and there's some evidence of this, I run the risk of creating too much of a muddiness in the foreground. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this painting as far as I can, and then I'll likely apply some glazes and some scrumbling after the painting dries, in order to ensure that we have both the depth that we want in the shadow patterns, and at the same time have some nice color showing through. In this light, it does show some evidence of some muddiness where colors are mixing on canvas. One of the ways to avoid that is to start with really wet paint, thin paint, with whatever solvent you're using. In my case, I'm exclusively using boiled linseed oil or refined linseed oil. And then gradually working your way up to thicker paints. That often will help. The thicker paints can sit on top of the thinner paints, and it helps avoid a lot of that muddiness from occurring. And you get some nice colors that show through, even in the darker areas, like the ones in the foreground here. Working my way through, trying to get various effects with my paper towel. As you saw, I was shaping earlier. Now I'm just letting the paper towel kind of unfold and just creating some random striations and scratch marks with the softer edge of the paper towel on the paint. Now I'm mixing up a tinted gray again for the sky. Working my way through. In this case, I have a mixture of ultramarine blue, tiny bit of that, and a tiny bit of violet, and that's mixed into the gray. And the attempt there is just to lay the foundation, extend the foundation for the sky. The cloud canopy that is near the top of the sky will catch some of the rays from the sunrise peeking, or sunset, bowing down over the horizon. And in the painting that I'm studying here, Cullen Yates creates a nice sense of depth in the sky, and just a beautiful, beautiful feeling, almost as if one you might feel when you're witnessing a sunset after a nice day spent outside with family or friends, or taking a hike, or doing something else that's healthy for your body and your mind and your soul. And then just witnessing the sunset. Sometimes it'll just be a great way to cap off a wonderful day. And that's kind of the feeling I got when I first saw the Cullen Yates original. I try and recreate some of that feeling with this study. I went through and sprinkled in a little bit of ultramarine blue mixed in with that gray. Wiped off my brush, and now I'm going to go through and reinforce the shadows in the foreground. I'm going to try my best not to cover up some of those scratch marks that we created with the paper towel, because I think that'll create some interesting effects within the shadows. And we're up to the 24-minute mark almost here, and if you're still watching, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, if you didn't catch it, we're going to have a shorter version of this video, which will also be posted. It'll likely be 8 times speed, so you can watch the whole thing in about 10 to 15 minutes at most. And I won't be able to give full tutorial notes, but I'll include some. And toward the end of this video, there was a poem that I came upon, which I'm also going to read, and I thought it just matched so perfectly with this painting. And I listen and read as much as I can. I listen to podcasts and audiobooks as much as I can, and I think I was reintroduced to this poem through a podcast that I've been listening to lately called Michael Meade, or it's produced by Michael Meade, and it's kind of a spiritual slash mythical sort of podcast. And a lot of the turn of the century painters really focused in on the spiritual aspects and mythical aspects that came along with the study of nature and humanity. And it's just weird. It just has like a strange fit. So that'll be coming up in a little bit. Right now, I turned to my palette knife because I felt like there was an opportunity to scratch off some of the paint around the edges of the tree tops and other areas where foliage kind of juts out into the sky, and to start creating some patterns that were a little bit more reflective of the scenario that you see in nature, where more light comes through from the sky through the ends of the tree limbs. And I'll do this a couple times. I also created some scratch marks around the bases of the tree and the trunks, and also going through the shadowy silhouetted foreground here, and doing the same thing. You're starting to see too, some of the paint is beginning to dry, so in some areas where I scratch away, it's coming off in masses that are not really that desirable. So I'm going to quickly stop there and soften the hillsides and mountain ranges in the background a little bit more with my blending brush, which is actually, I think, part of a makeup brush kit that I may have borrowed either from my wife or my daughter, who knows. And the process continues. I'll go back to my shop towel, wipe away some paint, apply some paint, maybe make some scratch marks with my palette knife, maybe blend some colors, soften some colors with a blending brush, apply some paint, wash, rinse, repeat. It is a process. And that's not to suggest that there's not that it's stealing from the creativity involved, but you do need a process when endeavoring in creating a painting like this, where you're trying to represent a complex scene. This is actually kind of a simple scene, but still complex because it does focus on a few elements in nature, and a process for completing a painting like this is really, really helpful. There's a couple of key foundational things that if you do them out of order, or if you do them or exclude or omit any part of it, it's going to be really difficult to create the effects that you might set out to create. Even with a process, there's quite a bit of freedom. For instance, in this painting, I'm intentionally trying to make it a little bit of a brighter painting than the original. I'm trying to introduce some brighter colors. I tend to lean in that direction. And I know some purists that might look at some of these turn of the century painters, particularly when they painted in tonalist styles. They, if they look at my painting, they might not appreciate the additional color and brightness that I try to include, but I just like to bring some optimism in amongst the other feelings that are created in these sorts of paintings that involve a scene with a large mass of silhouetted shapes, and I don't want it to be I don't know what the term is, but I don't want it to be too dark or too blah. I like a little color. So there you have it. The process will actually enhance your ability to be creative and do things your own way, and in most instances I find it can be freeing. I don't know what that sound was. It was either somebody yawning in the background there, or it was maybe our 7-month-old puppy kind of howling at somebody. I don't know. But right now I'm working my way through the process that I've described a few times now, just patting away some excess paint and reshaping some of those hills in the background. And once again, using that blending brush with such the lightest touch possible to help kind of blend the horizon line into the sky. We don't want that to be a hard and fast line at this point. In this particular image, those mountains are so far off in the distance as we look through this valley that it gets really, really difficult to distinguish the sky from the horizon itself. At this point, I'm taking a look at that sky, and I see there's an opportunity to add some deeper hues. There are some subtle oranges and reds that are viewable in Yates's original, and I want to get those in there. So I'm mixing up a little bit of cadmium yellow and cadmium red, and building out an orange that I'm going to layer in. I'm going to use it for two reasons. One, to warm up the sky and create some interest, but also going to use it to help build suggestion of some depth as well by creating striations in the cloud. Striations that grow closer together and less visible as they get closer to the horizon line. That will often help create the indication of depth along the cloud plane that covers the earth. So that's what I'm going to try and do here. And I will wipe some of it away, as has been the case with most of the elements within this painting. I'll put some paint down, I'll wipe some off in an attempt to reshape and refine what I have going on in the areas that I lay down paint. This made me think of a funny story mixing up that paint. When I was a kid, my dad and my mom had a 65 Mustang, and at one point, if I remember the story correctly, we had it repainted, and we were under the impression when the car left our driveway that it was going to be painted red, and it came back and it looked a little orange. And my dad, let us know that I guess the company, it might have been Mako for all I know, that painted it, said it was actually a shade of red called Calypso Red. And I don't know, it looked orange to me. So when I was mixing up this paint, it kind of reminded me of that. I'm just taking a step back and trying to understand what might help move the painting forward from this point. It's important to do. We're at the point where we're more than halfway through this painting. The closer you get to done, the more important it is to take frequent pauses and take your time to assess what the best next steps are for you. At this point, it looks to me like this is a good opportunity to build out the shadowy foreground. I'm actually going to work on building some shapes within the foreground to help create interest and hopefully direct the eye to some of the parts of the painting that are intended to be the focal points. So I'll create some striations and some lines that are intended to be indicative of some shrubs and maybe some rocks that are laying there in the shadows. And I'll build those in, probably another 2, maybe 3 rounds of building up those shadows before I'll call it finished. I'll also use it as an opportunity to selectively raise areas of that foreground horizon line. And now I'm going to start introducing some marks made by a cotton swab or a Q-tip. Depending upon the scale at which you're working, Q-tip could be an extraordinarily helpful tool. On a smaller scale like this, you could use it to apply paint, to blend, to soften edges, wipe paint off in selective areas. With a larger painting, you can use a Q-tip for the same things, but it also can be helpful by taking paint off. You can create the illusion of detail, almost like you would with the back of a paintbrush, but just with a softer dimension to it really good for making tree trunks off in the distance on larger paintings. So patting my way through, just building up some of the darker shadow patterns. Again, using this cotton swab, using a mixture of burnt umber. In this case, I think it's mostly burnt umber, but in some cases a mixture of burnt umber and sap green. And I just want to make sure I continue to refine and sharpen the contrast between the lit sky in the background and the shadow casted upon these shapes in the foreground and the midground because they're backlit. So I'll just work my way through and we'll continue on that path. Here I'm going to take my palette knife and I'm going to mix up what will likely be the darkest shadow color. It appears almost as if it's black, but it doesn't involve the use of any black paint. I'm essentially taking some ultramarine blue, some sap green. I'm introducing some cadmium red, and it's going to make a very intensely dark brown that has a little bit of a cooler shade to it because of the addition of the ultramarine blue. And I'm going to use it up in that area in the foreground here at the very top of the hills. In the areas where I'm painting here, there's a little buildup of earth, maybe even a little rock wall here and there, or the ground might be raised a little bit just because of the tree trunks amongst the trees, and there's just simply more light blocked in those areas. As you get closer to us here in the foreground, the tips of grass and leaves and the tops of rocks might catch a little bit more light, so it's a little lighter in the foreground close to the bottom of the board here, and it's much, much darker as you get up toward the tops of the hills there. So I'm just trying to create that indication by using that darker bluish brown, and I'll splash a little of it throughout the foreground as well, again, just to create some variance amongst the patterns there, create some interest. So I'll start mixing up some more grays to introduce them to the sky, especially toward the top. I want to make sure that I do a good job of creating the appearance of there being almost a canopy of clouds. And I just want to make sure that the brightness is accentuated too. That way the contrast between the trees and the land in the foreground here is significant enough where it feels like an image that I want to look at. Oftentimes when you get a little too muddled and you're kind of caught in between and there's not enough contrast, a painting can just simply not be interesting enough to really draw the viewer in. I'm also going to use some of that same color to help desaturate the lower parts of the hills in both ranges that we see here. We see that range way off in the distance, and we see a range that's a little bit closer. And if you ever notice this, sometimes it could be due to haze, sometimes it could be due to just atmospheric perspective in a landscape. The clearest line that you'll see in a mountain range often will be at the tops of the mountain, unless it's cloud covered or fog, mired in fog. And then oftentimes the part of the hill that comes down to the next level that's closest to you will appear to be even more desaturated than the top of the hill. And that's what I'm trying to emulate here. Also trying to create some marks to indicate that there might be some various shadows, just so it doesn't look too perfect or too symmetrical. It's very rare that you see, a really smooth surface in nature. So just trying to stay true to that and hopefully create an illusion that resembles far off distant hills. I'm going to mix up some titanium white with just a little bit of ultramarine blue, and I'm going to look to continue to cool down portions of the sky selectively. And I find that if we have both cool and warm tones in the sky, it just makes it look a little bit more interesting, and it also helps enhance the warmth of the glow of the sunlight just over the horizon, which will come in near the end of the painting. From here on out, also going to refine some of the sky holes and make sure that some of those color variations carry through, because you would actually see indications of those within the treetops where the sky holes appear. And as always, I'll smooth down the sky just to make sure that it has the qualities of wispy clouds off in the distance. At this point, I'm noticing in some areas, like that spot in the upper left-hand corner, some of the saturation of the mixture of titanium white and ultramarine blue. It's just a little too much. Also in other areas of the sky, but particularly areas closer to the treetops and where the light's coming through the tree holes and tree limbs. Just going to soften that a little bit and break that up, and I basically folded my paper towel into a point, and I'm using that point like a nub on almost like a blending stick to refine those edges a little bit. Just work my way through there, and now I'm going to go back to my Q-tip, and I'm actually going to get some pigment on there after a quick wipe, and I'm going to work that into a little pathway. Sometimes the eye might interpret that as a stream. Not sure what the intention was actually of Yates when he painted the original. But at first I'll try and get close to what he had created there, the effect he had created there. And then I'll probably try and put my own little spin on it as we get further along in the painting. But we're getting pretty close. We're right about 45 minutes in. I did realize this morning that I lost one of the video files, so the actual total elapsed time for this painting would be closer to 1 hour and 11 minutes. It's going to be shortened a little bit, only because of that little bit of video getting lost somewhere out in the cloud. Working my way through with my palette knife and creating some additional patterns and striations there in the shadows, just trying to create some interest. Now I'm reinforcing the darkest area of the shadow toward those hilltops in the foreground here. Just want to make sure I do my best to reinforce those darker areas. That'll go a long way to help ensure that the sunset and the light that kind of dances just over the horizon has the greatest effect and the right amount of intensity, because it'll be in stark contrast to those darker shadow areas. I'm going to take some yellow ochre, looking at the hillsides in the foreground here, and just work some of that in. Want to make sure that I do my best to create some interest and allow for there to be some hints of highlights. So I'm just going to use the side of my brush here and scrub and pat some of that yellow ochre in, almost pure yellow ochre, to reinforce some of the shapes and the patterns, all along the way being mindful of wanting to draw the viewer's attention up the hill toward those ridges and toward the valley view and the beautiful colors in the sky. And this looks, at this point, a little messy and haphazard, but I'll come back through in just a minute and selectively wipe some of this paint off. What this will also do too is, by brightening this ever so slightly, it'll help ensure that the darkest areas toward the top of that mountain, that hilltop on both sides, appear even darker. And again, like I mentioned earlier, this has to do with the interesting effect of there's more of a vertical slope in those areas toward the hilltops, so the shadow is a little bit deeper and a little bit more solid, whereas here in the foreground you do get a little bit of light dancing over the tops of the grasses and weeds and brush and so forth. And now I'm going through and reinforcing some of the darker areas in that same area with almost pure burnt umber, and in some cases with a little bit of sap green. So if you've followed along so far, you're part of a very small, I would say, hardy bunch. So I'm going to read a quick poem which kind of struck me, just given the times we're living through now and the tone and some of the components of this painting. It's called "In a Dark Time" by Theodore Redke. In a dark time, the eye begins to see. I meet my shadow in the deepening shade. I hear my echo in the echoing wood, a lord of nature weeping to a tree. I live between the heron and the wren, beast of the hill and the serpents of the den. What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? The day's on fire. I know the purity of pure despair, my shadow pinned against the sweating wall. That place among the rocks, is it a cave or a winding path? The edge is what I have. A steady storm of correspondences, a night flowing with birds and ragged moon, and a broad day, the midnight come again. A man goes far to find out what he is. Death of the self in a long, tearless night, all natural shapes blazing unnatural light. Dark, dark my light, and darker my desire, my soul, like some heat-maddened summer fly, keeps buzzing at the sill. Which eye is I? A fallen man, I climb out of my fear. The mind enters itself, and God, the mind, and one is one, free in the tearing wind. Yeah, particularly, I heard this poem, I think, read by Michael Mead as part of his podcast called The Myth. And, I thought there were a couple of things that he pointed out that really resonated with me, and kind of resonated with this painting in some weird way. But I thought I'd share it. Maybe check it out. You could obviously Google that, find out more both about that podcast and a little bit of poetry. I'm not a poetry guy, but some of the stanzas there kind of struck me in an unusually strong way. So I don't know. Maybe it's the path in this painting. Maybe it's the shadowy kind of foreground. But I don't know. Maybe it's the proximity of the location of this painting, being so close to our home in an area where we hike and kayak quite a bit. But we're coming on the 50-minute mark, and I'm just doing a lot of the same things, just reinforcing the shadows. I am taking some care to minimize the intensity of some of the highlights. This painting really, in my mind, I'm not sure what Yates thought, but in my mind, this painting is really about
Thank you very much.
The sun rays peeking over the horizon and the mood that creates. And there really is something magical about sunrise and sunset. I'll tell you, my day feels much more complete if I'm able to witness one or both of those. And it's, if you've ever had a chance to sit and listen out in a country setting to the birds kind of awakening in the morning as the sun starts to come up, there is a certain energy that that's generated from that, which is really, really a wonderful thing to see. And the same goes with sunset. If you're able to find some quiet time, often it's a little bit more difficult at the end of the day with all the stresses of the day and the activities that might still be going on at sunset. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to capture the same kind of feeling at that point, but it still is quite magical. So we're at the point where I'm going to start refining some things and getting this painting to the point where I'm gonna stop, at least in the first sitting. I'll probably, once the painting dries, continue to do some work with some glazes and such. But for now, I'll start putting in some of the highlights. And here I'm using almost pure, actually it is pure cadmium yellow, and I'm doing that very carefully. I don't want to overdo it. There isn't a lot of yellow in this painting, but I'm going to very carefully just sprinkle it through with a liner brush and make sure that we do our best to represent those yellow rays of sun bouncing off of the clouds in the sky. We'll sprinkle some through within the tree holes or sky holes within the trees as well. And if you've ever looked at a tree that's backlit, you'll see this. You'll see the light bouncing off in every direction with no rhyme or reason. Also reinforce some of the reds. Sometimes when sunlight is passing through clouds, the clouds will reflect the light. Sometimes they'll amplify and alter the light like a prism, and that's why we get all these beautiful colors. So I was a little heavy-handed with the red in particular, so we'll take our paper towel here and roll it up, and we'll do a quick wipe. But before we do that, we're going to try and soften it a wee bit with our blending brush. Yeah, and actually that looks pretty good. I might not need to wipe. We'll see. Take a step back, getting real close to the end of the painting, so it's even more important than it had been to take the time to pause and observe and ask yourself some questions. What's working in this painting? what's not? How can I improve this painting? What can I do now while I'm still painting wet on wet, wet paint on wet paint? Or what should I do later, maybe, to try and enhance this painting? These are the sorts of questions that I'll try and ask myself. I've learned over time, and by watching other instructional videos. So I'm also going to take some time to add some little hints of almost like a lavender color, which I mixed by way of violet and titanium white. I'm going to work that into some of those grayer clouds. Will have, if you look real closely, oftentimes, and this will happen throughout, nearly almost all times of day. If you look at clouds and you really watch them, they'll have all kinds of colors in them. Sometimes it's green, sometimes it's yellow. Very rarely will you see white puffy clouds that look like, cotton candy or a cotton swab, or a bunch of cotton balls laid on top of one another. Often there'll be all kinds of colors and all kinds of shapes. In this case, I do sense that there was a little violet, a little lavender type color in the clouds that Yates created, and I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do that my own style. This painting is going to be a little bit brighter. A little bit more optimistic, I guess, in some ways because of that. And I'm okay with that. It's a study. It's an interpretation, my own interpretation, and my own work based upon this great piece that Cullen Yates had originally created. So it doesn't need to be a perfect copy. This is more of a learning experience. Go ahead and reinforce some of those shadow patterns. Hopefully you've enjoyed this so far and got something from it. I will post a shorter version of this video in a time-lapse format with some commentary. Maybe I'll read that poem again, who knows. But there's just some people that don't have the intention of taking this much time to learn, and I want to honor that. And if you did enjoy this and get anything out of it, please feel free to hit the like button, subscribe, maybe share this video, and take a look at my website, thomasmichaelnieman.com. I'll go ahead and I'll post a final version of this painting at some point on my website, and there's other works there too. Really appreciate you taking the time to check this out. We're getting pretty close to wrapping up, just some final touches. See, I'm using a real light touch there, just patting up some of the excess paint. And I basically just refreshed my paper towel. I'm doing the same thing, just with a piece that's balled up a little bit more tightly. Just patting, basically putting down the paper towel and carefully lifting it up, being sure not to move it side by side. So I don't want to create smudges. I just want to lift off some excess paint there. Now I re-rolled the paper towel. It's very loose, and I'm actually using some of the edges that have unfolded and unrolled, and I'm just patting it down on the treetops, trying to create some nuanced shapes, doing the same thing across the foreground too. Some striations and very light scratch marks in the surface of the paint. Again, just want to make it interesting. Don't want it to be one solid form of, some crazy mixture of burnt umber and sap green with a little bit of yellow ochre. Don't want it to be just one big mud puddle. So, taking some care to create some interest.
but doing it so in a subtle way so it does not distract from the focal point of the painting. Working my way through, reinforcing some of the darker shadow patterns with some almost pure burnt umber. In some cases, it's burnt umber mixed with ultramarine blue and some red to create almost a black, and using that to reinforce some of those shadow patterns there, just by applying the paint with my Q-tip or cotton swab. Reinforcing now some of those tree trunks, some of those bigger tree trunks, and I'll come through a little bit later. I'll use my palette knife and some, I think maybe even a liner brush to create some other kind of smaller tree trunks and some scrubby brush at the top of that hill. I'm mixing up another gray, just right on my Q-tip, adding a little bit more of that ultramarine blue, and I just want to highlight some of those brighter cloud striations. I take some care not to overdo it because I don't want it to take away too much from the nice yellow we have down toward the horizon line. I just feel like there are a few areas that could use a little bit. Could use a little bit of lightening, and those areas are across the middle portion of that sky in the upper left-hand corner, and then throughout some of the tree areas as well. It's just an opportunity to strengthen the contrast between the sky and those trees, and allow for the viewer to have some interesting tidbits to explore throughout that sky. So I'll work on that for a few minutes, and I may even overdo it a little bit because I like what I see at this point, but I'll go back and make some corrections or alterations in just a moment. But here's where I believe a lot of the magic happens. Getting some of this brighter color worked in to create these effects of light bouncing off of the trees and coming through the trees, and some of those areas where the foliage is just a little bit more sparse. I feel like that enhances the drama and the mood of the painting. It does a real nice job of that, and you'll see that kind of come together in the finished version. It also helps thin out some of the edges. So we'll blend that again. We just don't want so many harsh edges. A real light touch here, barely touching the canvas. You want to make sure that blending brush is clean and hasn't picked up any paint if possible. I'm going to work through with my palette knife and look to enhance some of the branch marks, and work in by having a little bit of some of my darker shadow color on the edge of that knife. Work in some smaller tree branches and tree trunks and so on, just to make it look a little bit more natural and a little less symmetrical.
Hey, bud, I think Amelia's talking to Olivia. If you want to poke your head over there and say hi.
I'm gonna put down my palette knife in just a minute. It's done its job for the most part, and right now I'm looking at some of the patterns within the sky, and I think there's an opportunity to make some slight improvements. So a couple more scratches. Now working a couple more little hints of tree trunks and branches and that sort of thing. But I really like the way this is coming together so far.
Downstairs in the basement by the groceries.
There we go. So I'm going to put down my palette knife for a little bit, give it a rest, and I'm going to mix up a little bit of titanium white with some of that cadmium yellow, and we're just going to reinforce some of those beautiful streaks flowing through the sky, and make sure that we play against the work that we just created by enhancing the sticks and the tree trunks a little bit, and make sure that shines through in those gaps between those tree trunks and in the sky holes within the tree. Just want to make sure we do our job here and draw the viewer's eye up over that hill through those trees.
I can't recall at this point if I mentioned this or not, but I'm painting this during my typical Sunday session, usually around 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoons, after the day's activities are winding down and we're starting to prepare for the new week. I'll take the time to get some work in behind the easel. So in the background, you'll hear my family kind of talking, laughing. They might be watching a movie, they might be watching a ball game, or just talking about what's coming up in the week ahead. These are some of my favorite times. Oftentimes I'll rush to get a painting done so I can hang out with them. So we're close to finish with this one. A couple of up close scenes here, just so you can take a look at the brush strokes and whatnot. But I appreciate you watching, and I hope you stay well.